scene for the Byrds, for Arthur Lee and Love, and the Mothers and the Doors in 65, 66. Well, Carl Franzoni was one of the main wild dancers on that. You even have a picture of him on the Freak Out cover on the inside sleeves. And what I just discovered last night, and I posted on my Facebook page, is he's made a tribute to Gail. And he was probably born in the early 40s, so he's getting 73 or so years old. Or maybe he's born in late 30s, but he's pretty old. He put together these pictures of Gail, all ages that he had from his own archive, I guess, from his own experience, because he was a part of the Mothers of Invention Auxiliary. You know, he traveled around. He went to London when Frank first went to London in September 67, and there's that famous Italian actress, something Cardinali, Angela Cardinali, or Claudia Cardinali, I think her name was. Cardinali. And she's
Cardinali.
Frank Cardinali, right. And he's dancing around with her in the New Musical Express or Melody, whatever pop music magazine they're in. And there's Carl Franzoni. He was included in the picture with Frank and Claudia and some other guy, one of the Mothers. So it's very interesting to look at his video and what he says about Gail. But the main thing he says, Carol, is that Gail was the prettiest young woman in Hollywood. And and of course she looked like you. So she was an extension of the TV body of Connie into Hollywood. But he shows some really good pictures. But in the course of looking at that, I got out Barry Miles's book on Frank Zappa. He was one of the first intelligent journalists investigating and interviewing Frank. And he writes out a pretty detailed history of Gail. Now, this guy who died the other day, who wrote the book that Laurel Canyon and the Byrds and Neil Young and Stephen Stills and Crosby were all military brats who were part of a conspiracy on behalf of the CIA, and they include Frank Zappa's log cabin, which he didn't move into until 1968. And when he took it over in 68, who moved out? Vito and Carl Franzoni, the dancers. They had lived in that building. Tom Mix, the famous 1920s cowboy Hollywood star, he owned that place and had a secret tunnel over to Houdini's home nearby. So Frank occupies that in 68, but the Byrds conspiracy, according to the Laurel Canyon guy, Dave McGowan, that writer, he says it started 66, 67, to distract the protests, the anti-Vietnam protest movements, by getting the kids into sex, rock, and roll, and drugs. And it was symptomatic that all these kids who were the stars of those bands were sons and daughters of the military. Well, Jim Morrison and Gail Zappa knew each other as 4-year-olds, wherever it was in Florida someplace, because their fathers were in the higher levels of the military. And Jim Morrison's father was a key conspirator in the Gulf of Tonkin hoax thing that started sort of officially the Vietnam War. And so you've got Jim Morrison and Gail Zappa together, and she hits him over the head with a hammer at that point. But she moved, the family, her father moves to London, and she got a gig through her father for the Office of Naval Intelligence. So it just came out a month before David died, when Gail died back on October 7th this year, at a memorial or in some situation in public where her son Amit says that Gail worked with the CIA and saved the world. And Amit says his uncle told him that. So I don't know who his uncle is. And so this talking about Gail as a CIA asset or something rubbing up against the intelligence agency supports David McGowan's point. And of course, McGowan had to be snuffed a month later, right? But what's interesting is that I read Barry Miles's book years ago, but I had forgotten that. If she is in the Office of Naval Intelligence as an employee, as a young person, in 63, 64, 65, before she goes to L.A., because the family moved back to the New York area. He had a new military posting, her father did. that could explain how she had intelligence connections just by whatever she did in the Office of Naval Intelligence. And, being a young, pretty girl, the higher-ups would definitely want her around and, nurture her or have her do something. And, we met Gail way back there in 1970 is one of the more prominent times, and she certainly came across as a haughty, snobbish person who did not seem to tolerate people talking to Frank. She didn't tolerate us at that point. And you remember her haughty body language? Yeah? So was she a handler for Frank? I don't think so, but there's lots of food for somebody to develop that idea.
Yeah, because back then when we were visiting with Frank, we were sitting down in the basement. And
well, that's 1988. I'm talking about 1970.
Well, even 1988.
She kept interrupting.
Yeah, and she was so detached from him and his work and his people and his friends and his influences. She couldn't be bothered even saying hello to us or getting to know us and what wonderful people we are.
Right.
That's how she missed out.
She poked her head in and said, "It's 45 minutes, Frank." In other words, she had a deal where I'll come down and interrupt you every 45 minutes so that you don't have to keep talking to whoever's there as an interviewer or something. But Frank said, no, I'm okay. And then she came down a couple of times, and then she finally came down and said, "Beverly's here." And Frank said, yeah. So when Frank put on the album at the end of the first 3.5 hours, he put on Broadway the Hard Way, which was just going to be released a week later in the end of October 1988. And so we listened to it with him, but I noticed I closed my eyes, and then about 20 minutes into it, I opened my eyes, and he had gone. He had left. So he went up to see Beverly D'Angelo, the actress who eventually married Al Pacino, but she is famous for playing Patsy Cline in Coal Miner's Daughter, I think, the movie about Loretta Lynn. And she has a good walk-on part. But she was a singer, I think, in Ronnie Hawkins' band up in Toronto, even though she was an American in the 60s. And Ronnie Hawkins' band became the band for Dylan. She became a good friend of Gail. And so I guess Frank was supposed to go up and see Beverly while he had a break with us. Then he came back down, and we then did 3.5 hours talk, not recorded, and got into the paranoid stuff. So I recommend people go and look at this collage that Carl Franzoni put together. He's a voice on there that we just heard, Help 'em Rock. Okay, Roxy, is there some things you want to begin with?
Of course. Yes, there's many people saying Frank Zappa was infiltrating the rock scene to sort of avoid or impede that the hippies reach their goal of love and peace. But I think it's not true. If one studies Zappa's life, he was actually bullied by the authority from the beginning, and I don't think he was working for them.
Right. I mean, he even says on the album We're On for the Money that there's a guy creeping around in Laurel Canyon who works for the CIA. So he's saying they're CIA people. He's exposing it on his third album. And he even did a song around that period, 60, 67, about Ronald Reagan, who was governor of California. And he was saying that Reagan was the CIA's man, CIA agent, and that he would be promoted to become president eventually. And that was the big discovery Mae Brussell made in 1973 after Watergate. And then McLuhan talked about Reagan inevitably becoming a president in 75, 76 for bottom-up reasons, not conspiratorial reasons. But so you have these holy offices, Mae Brussell, Frank Zappa, Marshall McLuhan, all zeroing in on the role Reagan would play. And Mae Brussell said that to the degree that there would be a police state in the United States, it was rehearsed in California first. and things were tried out. Like they even had a FEMA camp thing called the Garden Plot, where Reagan wondered about, as Governor Reagan wondered about how to implement and arrest the radicals running around in Berkeley and in Los Angeles, and the communists and anarchists and Negroes. Zappa's writing about it.
Yes, and
songs about it.
We should not forget that Frank's father was also working for the chemical war industry.
Well, that would be what David McGowan would emphasize, that like Stephen Stills and Crosby and all these other guys.
Like now I understand things. It's like in a way he needed to be inside that environment to understand from the inside that there is no...
Are you saying Frank needed to, or Frank's father? Frank or Frank's father?
His non-physical Frank's.
Yes,
non-physical, came forth like that because he needed to be an insider of these things and see that many of the things he was talking about are not conspiracies, are real experiments, and even his father was affected by those, and his family. And
right. Let me tell you what, in relation to that, the new book by Frank's brother, Bobby Zappa's book, he says that his father worked with a lot of military projects for many years, and he would stay in a town and work there for a year or so. He did this a lot in California from like 1951 on. Oh, Bert's here. Okay, we'll let Bert in. Is that you, Bert? This one?
Yes. Yes.
Okay. So in California throughout the 50s, Frank's father would get a job in some military aspect, and he'd last about a year, and then they have to move somewhere else. And it was really upsetting to Frankie and Bobby that they had to move all the time, every year, and lose their friends and not even be able to have time to make any friends. So it was very hard on them as kids, and I guess on Candy, their younger sister, and Carl, the younger brother. But Bobby raised the question, we don't know if our father had integrity and that he would be asked to go into top secret stuff eventually, and he would refuse it. So he'd quit and go try to get a job somewhere else. Or he was an incompetent guy, and he was quite an asshole. Bobby presents him that way, admits it. He may have caused trouble and was laid off because he wasn't trusted. So it is something that, as a family, they thought about and talked about. Like, why was their father always losing it once a year, and was it based on a good reason or a bad reason? The good reason is that he would not compromise himself and get into dangerous black projects, or he just couldn't do it. So what happens is that Frank writes this Uncle Meat movie in 68, 69, and I read that interview in the first show from Richie York. It's the only explanation, the only interview where Frank talks about this. I was looking at some other people, and they were saying, we never knew what Uncle Meat was about. Frank was talking about it, but we never saw really what the movie was about. But he spells it out to Richie York in the Globe and Mail or Toronto Star paper, and it's obviously about his father, who gets involved with some top secret stuff and then quits, and is pissed off that he's fired. But Frank makes the whole question about his father part of this movie, Uncle Meat, and then it gets overlaid with another plot by a guy named Uncle Meat, who's a former government scientist who's now gone rogue and is using new knowledge to beat back the government. Now, this theme is in all the screenplays that I read this week to get prepared for this show. I read the 1964 screenplay treatment called Captain Beefheart versus the Grunt People. Then 5 years later, Frank updated it in 1969, where he was going to have Grace Slick and Jim Morrison play the characters that were just local people in 1964. And then he does Hunch and Toot in 72. I read that, and then I read Them or Us, his monster masterpiece, where he bundles all these previous treatments into one huge, massive book with a lot of the conceptual continuity. But it's always about a government scientist, an inside guy getting fired. It's always about that. Every play, pretty well.
This links perfect with what I would like to talk about tonight.
Okay, go ahead.
Or today. Yes, because for me, it was a big revelation to understand the concept of artist for Marshall McLuhan is so expanded. And he would say an artist is a man of any field, it can be humanistic or scientific, who grasps the implications of his actions and of the new knowledge, the new technologies. So he sees an artist as a hybrid, and his work is not only the single pieces of work he produces, but himself, the artist, is the medium. And that's he's already embodying this new hybrid of scientist, artist, and that's why he was criticizing.
You mean Frank is? Frank is embodying that. Yeah, you're right.
Yes, and I understand now from reading McLuhan and learning from Bob, to understand Frank Zappa fully, completely, you need to understand what Marshall McLuhan and Bob are saying. Because Frank Zappa is not only about the music. He was really this new type of post-literate, tactile.
He was a new type
artist.
of porcelain. He was a new type of porcelain.
Yes, and he himself understood, on the one side, the continuity his work has with the past, but also that it's not only about entertaining music or being famous. I mean, he could have been just a rock star, but he pushed all boundaries in every aspect of what he was doing. For example, one of the things he will criticize about the industry and the entertainment, he said, it's very good, we need this thing called art or entertainment music, because living is so tough, and people need this relaxing. But he saw how you could be programmed by the environment created, for example, in the hippie freak scene of sex, drugs, and rock and roll. It's just a distraction, while the bankers, as he said, they're really working and you're just having fun. And he also criticized a lot the disco scene because that was the music of cocaine. And he said, this music is not about the music. It's just about getting together in a dark place and have sex. And he was trying to...
He would say it was about lifestyle. He would say it would be audio wallpaper for your lifestyle.
And also a way of promoting substances that go with that music. And one of the things that he never got aired in mass media. He will be a guest in many talk shows, but he will be always presented as a type of freak or entertainment and something. He was always being blasted by the people. And he reacted with the satire. Instead of fighting back, he will show his intelligence and be funny. And people will react good. They will be maybe curious. Who's this crazy guy with the mustache. And he's not only about the music. That's the main point I would like to do today. I mean, the music is amazing. And I'm reading The Loss of Media, and this book made me understand more aspects of Frank, because McLuhan was being criticized that he was not scientific. He was, like Pierre Schaeffer said, just making slogans and obscure metaphors. And many people could not see that what he was saying was so deep and was the only real explanation of what was going on.
Yeah, I agree with what you're saying. And you will see this in the screenplays. I'm reading these screenplays closely. He makes great metaphorical cartoons about this very thing you're talking about, being a scientist and an artist, a comprehensive person who has a small day job of being an entertainer, only a small part of his work.
Yes, but McLuhan also said in Understanding Media, in a culture like ours, long accustomed to splitting and dividing all things as a mean of control, it is sometimes a bit of a shock to be reminded that in operational and practical fact, the medium is the message. It's like, and what is this medium? The medias. And he saw this is a new type of science that really erases everything else, as Zion is saying. And this erasing that started with artists like Winston Lewis and Joyce that were already being this type of hybrids. And maybe that's the thing that many people don't understand about Bob, because he can talk about medicine and healing and then politics and then Zappa and the Matrix and using that he is a new type of artist, scientist, this new hybrid that was the archetype the thinkers in the Renaissance and during the Enlightenment wanted to achieve, the all-knowing. And that is part of the completion, that we're going to get to this point where we finally have all of our senses working as one, not only one being dominating, like during the fallen state, the visual has been dominating, and we will get back the knowing.
Yes,
but in the meantime, Marshall McLuhan discovered the 4 laws of media. And he says he was influenced by reading Bacon and Vico. These both had this... Bacon had the novum organum, which means the new organ, and Vico had the La Scienza Nuova. And they were already seeing there needs to be another type of science which doesn't fragmentizes and divides. Both of them had these 4 principles, but Marshall McLuhan went to develop the threat management. And it's very interesting because one of the reasons Bob was sent to infiltrate Marshall McLuhan and Frank Zappa was that they were using the threat management. Maybe you'd like to say something.
Well, I've said a lot about that. Let's just hold that for a minute. Bert, you weren't with us last week, were you? Or were you? Did you come in late? Or what happened? I don't remember you saying much.
No, I was there last week. Bob, this week I listened to on your Vimeo page the Living in Acoustic World, and I found a link. I thought of the connection of McLuhan and Zappa, because in that video, McLuhan brought out that rock music is like an oral form of education. That rock music, even though Frank was not really a rock musician, he was just a musician using music for his own weapon. But it blew me away. I never heard McLuhan speak about rock music in that way. I always heard that, he said electronic music shattered the universe and everything. But what he said in there, I took a note. He said that rock is a kind of a central oral form of education that threatens the whole educational establishment. And that's if you look at what last week you read a lot of the screenplay. You read some screenplays and Frank was using that as a tool. And what Frank used it as a complete tool is that he had the synclav, which was sort of like the technology, the musical instrument used. He used all those different sounds to actually get his message across. Yeah. To really teach people, open people, those who had ears to hear. You could say, if you wanted to use that type of
what was our
cliche.
New town? We say those who have the autonomic systems, because we don't have ears and eyes anymore. We're inside our guts, the extension of our nervous system. So those who have the autonomic system that can respond resonantly to the frequencies of us, that's who this is for. I never thought of that before. We don't have eyes and ears. We got autonomic systems, and we're inside each other's guts. I was describing on a What Youth a couple of weeks ago. Jermaine was online, so I started to describe the inner lining of a vagina. And then I started to describe the alimentary canal, is it called, where the shit comes down. So I was describing her shit and her bowels. Now, that's pretty rude and disgusting, but that's actually what we have to realize, that in the electronic disconic position, we're looking through the chemical body. We're inside the chemical body. That's why Burroughs and Joyce, McLuhan said, would have a lot of digestive processes as a metaphor in their books. Like Joyce said, all through Finney's Wake, you're inside a body. And that's how much we're inside every part of each other's bodies. So, Jermaine could describe my scrotum if she wanted to, as she's in there. So that's what it means to be discarnate. You have to change your eyes and ears. You're inside the guts of the other person. So, anyways, you were saying if you have the eyes and ears to hear it, what do you hear?
Well, it just changes your pattern. It just changes your pattern of what you normally.
Yeah, the metaphor is that Frank he couldn't get a top hit. He would present music to Clive Davis and these big guys who became moguls in the university, in the music world, and he would stick to his principles, and they would say, well, that has no commercial potential, we're not going to do it. So he was basically fired from the music industry, even though at Paul Buff's studio they were making hit records, a few hit records, and they were very talented. Yet the establishment would not let them in there. So he was basically fired, like he's always saying about Uncle Meade and his father were fired from government contract work. And he knew that entertainment was part of the government. So it's a metaphor for him. Finding a way to get to you is the lyrics in the Mother People song. I think on World for the Money. He's saying, we found a way to get to you. And he said it in some interviews we read a couple weeks ago. We can use rock to become a new kind of teacher, a new kind of educator, like for the high school. We're an antidote to the high school world. And he says on Freak Out, he says, drop out, forget the senior prom, drop out of school and go to the library. So he's actually got an agenda of radicalizing people, but not in any political sense, in the sense of left, right, center. And he's on a teaching mission. And nobody lists 179 people as these people have influenced me. First of all, people don't even tell who influenced them. And he lists 179 of them, and they're an inventory of the great teachers in music and in other topics in other fields in the 20th century. It was an education, as Roxy was saying. She's going through a list. I got this book. A guy named Scott Parker writes a book on the making of Freakout, and he lists all 179 people and tells you who they are. Now, there used to be a list that I had, but I haven't looked at it, so it's been updated. So if you want to later go into that list, it's pretty interesting who he includes on it. But including John Wayne. Yes, John Wayne. That came up in the chat line. So, Bert, Zappa is becoming a teacher, right? I mean, a high school teacher.
Yes.
He's infiltrating what McLuhan called the global classroom, the classroom without walls, and presenting a curriculum that's worth it.
Yes. Yes. And it's back then, it was probably kind of oddball for most, but he was really touching on or surveying the whole environment of the counter environment that he really saw that was sort of like the May Brussels approach of the conspiracy. So he used his music and his presentation to raise that point. And sometimes was humorous, sometimes was vulgar. Yes.
He was a journalist. He said he was a journalist. And one of his most popular songs, Trouble Coming Every Day, it has different titles, about the Watts Riot song. That's still a very powerful riot that he watched in August 1965 in Los Angeles. And he was criticizing the TV coverage of it as one of many things, but that's a tremendous song. And he said, that's me being a journalist. He talks about it, I think, in our interview with him. But he also said he was an anthropologist. And he, of course, was a physicist, and he had a grand unified theory. He covered it all. He was being HCE in Phineas Wake. He was doing everything, as McLuhan was. So it's remarkable that you have McLuhan, I call King Lear. He's an old guy who has to divvy up the legacy of Western man to his kids or to the next couple of generations, and that's King Lear's dilemma. And Frank is a King Lear, since he's in the McLuhan quadrant. How's he a King Lear? He's 10 years older than the audience that he's teaching, that he's infiltrating. He's 60, he's 26, 27, 28, and communicating to 15, 16, 17-year-olds. That's a King Lear. And he's trying to figure out what of the musical history of the 20th century is worth bequeathing to the next generations. That's
yes,
King job. He's taking it on.
To understand the phenomenon of Frank Zappa, it's like when you understand the laws of media, you see the logical result of what was going on and why would an artist like that appear in the horizon. Because with the laws of media, McLuhan saw all outerings are like words, also technologies. And this erased the boundaries between everything, between the metaphysical and the physical sciences, between art and technology, between high culture and low culture. He saw all human outerings have the same value, and all human outerings can be studied at the same level. And that's something Ian also shows all the time by making quotes from media and making us listening to three-chord songs.
Pop songs. Yeah.
And this is something that is a very important part of the style of Frank Zappa. He mentions in this list.
Can I just say something so I don't forget it? They have that joke. If somebody didn't exist, then we would have invented them. So you're exactly right. If Frank Zappa had not existed, we would have to have invented him as a necessary anthropomorphic anti-environment to the global theater of the 60s. There would have to be someone like that come forth to be an anti-environment to the new renaissance of music and sound experience that was happening. So, yes, we would have had to invent.
Yes, and I say after Bach, I talk about how he created the tonality that was a system that had a focal point, like the tonality, the main note was like the sun, and all the other notes around it were the planets, because he was biased by the Gutenberg galaxy and the visual space, and he wanted to translate this understanding of the power of God in the music. And this tonality, the harmony, this system was expanded and developed and used by Mozart and Beethoven. But then, when the electric environment comes forth, the artists start getting away from the tonality, and it's a logical sequence when we understand the laws of media, that because we're in a post-literate age, the things that were created for thousands of years by the Gutenberg galaxy, by the alphabet and the books, are destroyed in a few decades, and the artists go away from tonality because they are again immersed in the acoustic all at the same time, simultaneous.
Audile and tactile and kinetic.
Environment.
Multisensory sound.
Yes, and they start to expand not only, for example, there's the use of chromatic, which is like half tones. And for example, Schoenberg develops the system of the 12 tones in which all notes have the same importance. In the tonal system, there is like hierarchies, like the tonality is like the king, like the sun, and everybody, all the other notes are subjected to this tonality and have different harmonic functions. For example, for modulation or to move from one chord to other, there are these laws to create tension and then release. But Schoenberg makes a system where all the notes have the same importance. And Stravinsky also starts using a lot of chromatism, and they also become somehow kinetic. I think many of the contemporary composers were also influenced by movies, because many also made soundtracks, and the music becomes this type of narration with a lot of drama and sound effects, and they create big clusters and different types of instrumentations. They stopped using the traditional orchestra as it was, these families of the strings and metal winds and percussions, and they expand that group of instruments, and they start exploring other sound landscapes like traditional music, because in traditional music there are very weird harmonies and melodies and rhythms, and many come from, for example, shamanic traditions that had another function of getting you into a trance or having another type of effect. Is not only like for dancing or for having a nice music. And
that's very
in the list of the freak out, Zappa names Schoenberg, Weber, Bert, Stockhausen,
Stravinsky.
Cage.
Stravinsky. Stravinsky.
Yeah, Stravinsky. as his influences. And that's why I say after Bach, Zappa will be the most important, because it's not only about the music, it's how he's presenting the new ground and what's coming.
Right.
And he had his own chord Bible. And there are many aspects of his music that, like microtonality and the importance of rhythm, multi-rhythms, and then also the importance of technology as part of his musical language. He's not only composing with notes, but also with all sound landscapes, like everything he could get from radio, TV, and movies. Like he did all the 20th century.
You may not know this term, Roxy. He called it harmonic climates. Talk about media, hot and cold. Media as weather systems was McLuhan's definition. He used the same term, harmonic climates.
Yes,
but carry on with what you were saying.
Yeah, he gets into this new dimension, new hybrid. He could have become an academic experimental composer. I mean, he was then played by Boulez and respected by Barres and Cage and everybody, but he wanted to reach a wider audience, and he didn't want it to be limited by the environment of the academic elite. He wanted really to infiltrate the entertainment and present this new music, these new patterns, these new ideas to everybody. And he said everything is happening all the time.
Remember, everybody, a lot of people know this video. The first time he's on TV is the Steve Allen show, 1963, a week before The World's Greatest Sinner is going to have a showing in L.A. What does he do? He goes on and instructs Steve Allen and the orchestra of how to play the bicycle. He takes the teacher role in his first appearance on TV. He's going to show how to play the bicycle. You've seen that video, right?
Another thing, he will quote. Yes, I love that.
Yeah.
Because he asked the presenter asked him, "How long have you been playing the bike?" And he says, "Oh, a week." And he's already on TV.
For 2 weeks, I think he says. Yeah, a couple weeks. And all the time, Steve, who's a comedian, he's saying, "Oh, we've got a put-on guy here," and so I got to counter his put-on. So he kept saying, "Well," he turns to the audience. He says, "This is pretty neat." This guy was saying, "How can I get on TV?" You hear that? You remember that part? He goes, he starts thinking, imitating Frank's mind. He goes, "How can I get on TV?" "Okay, I'll teach him how to do the bike." He was making fun of Frank doing that, and Jerry Hopkins worked for Steve Allen, and Jerry Hopkins, we read some of his articles on Vito and the LA scene that were in the LA Free Press in the first show. He says that Steve Allen, I read this somewhere else later, Steve Allen told him after Zappa was on, and Steve was very cordial, but he said after, "Do not allow any more put-on artists on our show," because Jerry was in charge of guests, and he got almost lost his job having Frank on. But Steve Allen called Frank a put-on artist.
Well, that's what is kind of parallel to what I observed when I did The View. They wouldn't let me be funny.
That's right.
The host had to be the comedian.
Yeah.
And the guest was the dupe.
Yeah.
So Frank switched roles.
Yes, he out Steve.
Yep.
Okay, back to what you were saying, Roxy. We sidetracked into.
Yes, that one thing he quote often was a phrase. The present-day composer refuses to die. I mean, now that we know he's Francesco Zappa.
We knew he was telling us that he hadn't died. He had not died for 200 years.
Yes, but in a way that's completely ironic because in a way, with the discovery of the laws of media, that everything is like a language and speech. It's a type of music, has the same characteristics of any musical discourse. It's really music.
Yeah.
It's like we are all composers, and that's what Diane is saying with this new song of and you being the teacher that is going to teach us how to speak right. Because
right. Now, McLuhan in 1964 is explaining that. Carl Orff and these composers bringing sound into their compositions. The same year that McLuhan, who is 30 years older than Zappa. Now, Marcel Duchamp said an art phase lasts about 30 years, and then it becomes public property. So it's 30 years later, Zappa's born, late 40, early 41, 30 years after McLuhan's born, and he represents the next generation who's going to create a whole different art. But that's why Frank is writing about speech and music in his screenplay, Captain Beefheart versus the Grunt people. Grunting with speech. Beefheart meets the speech people. He's talking about it in his art the same year McLuhan's becoming famous, writing about it, metaphysically. So it's very interesting, the parallel between the two of them. And McLuhan's saying that young people can influence global consciousness now. He said that in 1964 in a National Film Board documentary. Well, for him, Zappa is a young person. So here's Frank creating a whole movement, sexual revolution and the freak out thing, as a young person, and
yes, because the market of youth was a novelty. It was
right.
Started with the rock and roll in the 50s, and the corporations saw there is a big market, and they have to start producing things for younger generations.
And they coined the term teenager. They were called adolescents before that, back in the 19th century, and they were meant to be seen and not heard. But now they could be heard, and so they had become a market niche, so they were called teenagers. So everybody was of some age, so they were the teen age. That meant everybody was a human being.
That's what Zappa says. Debbie is taking the chance of the music you are going to hear.
Yeah, Debbie controls the world.
This is stupid Debbie.
Revolve around Debbie. Let me just say something. Now, let me add this point about the present-day composer refused to die. McLuhan said that the Gutenberg press, agreeing with Ion, the 300 or 400 years of print was a dark age, where people's lives were short and brutal and limited, very limited. It only had one little dimension, then you died. That's what the printing press brought in, and it created history or time. Then he says the electric age retrieves eternity. So no longer have you got history under electric conditions, what he called the Marconi galaxy. Marconi inventing the wireless broadcasting, wireless technology. It's moved into eternity. That's another part of Ion's message, that we're moved out of the Gutenberg limiting effect of one life and very proscribed, into an expanding multi-access to many worlds, synesthesia, to eternity. So the present-day composer refuses to die. That's because we've retrieved the eternal in the world of language and electric media. You've started to experience eternity. So just want to supplement what you're saying there.
Yes, and I think he was really, or he is really aware of the real meaning of that phrase.
Right. Now, Bert, what ideas do you get from what we're saying at this point?
I see that the electronic approach that Frank took, because Roxana said a week ago that it struck a thought pattern for me, is that Bach developed the piano. Is that correct? And he used the 12 tones in the piano to create that.
Not the piano, the keyboard, the clavier.
Clavier, okay. Okay, the clavier. And what I see is with Frank, with the synclavier, he really opened up a whole new world of electronic communication, and because that's in synclavier, I don't think they're still using that, or if they are, they're not using it as complex as he did. Because like when I read in the Mother of All interviews, he was experimenting and discovering things that the company couldn't even figure out. And my question to Roxana is there, because, okay, the clavier had 12 tones. Now, in electronic music, I'm probably using the wrong language, but are the 12 tones magnified or increased? I mean, so that
we are not limited to the 12 tones. That's something at the beginning of the last century, the Russians and the Germans started to create other types of instruments that will generate sounds in an artificial way. Then that was developed with music concrete and electronic music. But at the beginning, there were no real technologies for a studio, for recording. There were other techniques like Edison made cylinders of wax, and that's how the first recordings were made. But then other technologies developed. And one way to control these sound generators, artificial, like one of the first responses of the engineers was to use a keyboard. I think it has to do with the fact that during the 19th century the keyboard was so popular, but maybe it also has to do with non-physical things like this tonal system was there until the electric environment, and it's a very easy way to say, I want this frequency, I want do, re, mi, fa, whatever you want, you just press the key. And it was funny that before, I remember all these organs and the first synthesizers were also made like wood looking. Like maybe it was part of the marketing that they wanted to make it something familiar that you could buy it for your living room, like a keyboard or an organ. And but there are many other types of, we call them controllers. Now the trend is to make this finger percussion. You just press different buttons and you assign different types of events to each button. Like, I want here a sequence, I want here this sound, I want this effect, or just percussions, whatever. And it was just, the synclavier was one of the first, when there was the personal computer, that allowed people to have recording studios at home. Before, it was so expensive. You had to be in a school, in an institution to have these machines. Like when I wanted to start making electronic music, they will not allow me to go inside the studio because they told me you need to be a composer, a mathematician, a programmer, everything, just to see if you can start composing. And that's how I landed with the Gurdjieff guy, because he was a composer. His family is very wealthy, and he had a house with a studio. And he found it very nice that I wanted to make electronic music. And he became like my mentor. And I got my own equipment, because at the time we had the Apple II Plus. You could have your own computer at home. And the synclavier was one of the first systems which had a sequencer, sampler, like a digital recording studio. But it was very, very expensive at the time. Like, not everybody could afford to have that. And there was, after that, also an instrument called Fairlight, but I don't even remember how much they will cost, but they were very, very expensive. And they had not much memory. One would laugh because now we have so much storage in any computer, but at that time it was like nothing, and they were so expensive.
Did you say the Sinclair didn't have much memory? Was it the Sinclair that didn't have much memory? Is that what you're referring to, Roxana?
Yes, in comparison with what we have now.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah,
we will see down that such an instrument costs so much with so little memory in comparison with what we can access now.
And she's talking about when she's 11 years old, which is 1979. She's talking about 79, 80, 81 when she's working with this Gurdjieffian, Gurdjieff mentor. She's just a kid, not even a teenager yet.
Okay. I will play the keyboards and then I will go play Barbies with the daughter of kids. Yes.
Did you say you would go play Varese? Did you know about Varese?
No, Barbies. Yes, I knew about Varese and about. But I was making electronic music and also playing Barbies at the time with the daughter of Antonio Rusek.
Right. You knew about Varese when you were 11? You knew about Varese when you were 11 years old, Roxana? Wow.
We had independent electronic music multimedia center, and all the composers, the most important composers, will come and record, or they needed PA, or we also did some festivals because we were the only ones. So everybody will come, and one of the things we will do is like, if they had a new piece, we will listen to that, or we will go record them. And that was a sort of training of education, because they will, for example, say, yes, in this piece I was influenced by John Cage, and look, here the harmonics and this and that.
Roxy started listening when she was... What? What did you say?
Yes, but I think if you have access, like Frank Zappa had to discover all this music by himself. He will go to shops and look in this obscure part of the shop, electronic music or contemporary composers or whatever, and he was really impressed that these wonderful music, wonderful ideas, these wonderful composers and sonorities were not on mass media. And look at the list he has. He even has like Silvestre Revueltas, he's a Mexican composer, and many others.
Who did he have? What name?
Silvestre Revueltas.
We were talking about that the other day. Yeah, there's someone, Zappa even knew about him. Now, let me say this, Roxy, before I forget the... he was aware of contemporary music not only in Europe, but in other countries. That's really amazing. Yeah. That he go to libraries, suppose, and research these things. Okay. And he puts this list. It's amazing. But he... Right. Now, I just want to say what's amazing about your situation is that you're sitting there at 11 years old, and you're the only kid around the adults, and these are accomplished musicians in the Mexican culture. And so Roxy sat for 80, let's see, what is that, 1979?
We had
30 years, till 2009. Yeah, no, but you sat, because you went to Berlin and sat in classes, and you still go and sit. She's still listening to people present their new high-tech compositions. 30 years later.
Wow.
79 to 2009, until Ion got her off her ass, and now she's here co-creating. But she got into this. This was her sport, her hobby, was listening to new developments in electronic technology, electronic music. That's what she did since she was 11 years old. She did it in Berlin.
Yes,
She still goes to that group.
In the Technische Universität, there are auditions every Thursday, and you get to listen to new technologies because there's a lot of engineers developing instruments and doing apps and programs.
Right
and also
now,
main studios from France or England or anywhere come and they have changes.
Okay, Bert, I want to say this.
Things.
Back to the Bach theme. Walter Boward said, Bob, there's only two people in the world who are going to understand you, and you haven't met them yet. Well, I'm inclined to think that Roxana is one of them because she's the first person to support what I say. I say Zappa is the greatest musician in the history of the world. Now, most people think that's an absurd statement. So the more you know what he did is that the idea that an individual genius could influence the culture comes in with the printing press. So Bach did that. And he sets out something that goes on for hundreds of years. You have to have a new technology, a revolutionary technology that actually obsolesces music to get away from the influence of Bach. And Zappa came along to be as significant in music as Bach was. And it'd take this long to get to that point. But that's like saying Zappa's completing music before it's now just in everybody's hands to make music. It's no big deal. It's just cooking. Anybody can cook.
Yeah.
And that's why Zappa's showing the cooking glove on his hand. He's mirroring what everybody's becoming, a cook. And music is made by anybody. This is the dilemma Dave Neufeld has as a producer. You know, it's hard to stand out when everybody doesn't want to listen to anybody else. They want to make their own stuff. So it's symptomatic that when the Android meme, the after image of the Android meme comes in the early 90s, Frank dies. You know, he's obsolete. But he will go down in history as the standard of someone who took what could be done and create something like McLuhan said. We had John Culkin saying earlier about McLuhan that we haven't even begun to understand what McLuhan's about. And he was saying that when McLuhan died in 1980. Now we do. It's been quite rapid, the updating of understanding McLuhan over the last 15 years for people because the environment just rubs it in their face. But and I would say that the idea of the medium is the message, that's McLuhan's point, and people are now understanding that because it's obsolete. The medium is not the message. Humans are not influenced anymore. And that's the Bob aspect. You know, if McLuhan was Bach, I'm Zappa. I'm completing when Bach started. McLuhan Bach. But back to this point, that Roxana is the first person I ever met who, she didn't understand this a year ago, but over the past year, she now makes this statement. Now, and she could say to any of her friends, she has a few artist friends who are in touch with her, and they're saying, I listen to the Zappa thing, I don't know what you guys are talking about. These are smart artists. They don't understand what she's saying. Because she's saying what I'm saying is that you've got to look at Zappa as a major historical phenomenon, like Bach was. And so I am impressed with Roxy. She's first.
Because Zappa is showing the new ground. That's the main function of an artist. Like in The Laws of Media, McLuhan explains it. Every medium concentrates in one sense.
Yes, enhance one sense. That's a tetrad. It extends one faculty. But
Zappa is doing what Joyce did for the book. He's doing. Yeah. He's presenting the new ground and showing all the implications of the work of the new hybrid.
The new hybrid is
not limited to just the music. It's all his altering.
Well, that's where you probably know more about this than me. You get Wagner, who wanted to create the total artwork. And so the idea of synesthesia, I don't know if he used that term, but he was trying to mix his media and make this big theatrical, comprehensive multimedia scene. Wagner starts it and influences the poets of his time, and you have every generation is trying to express the multi-dimensional nature of sound, not just sound for the ear. They want to get into the what turns out to be synesthesia, and Frank completes that synesthetic process because the android means technology. The computer can simulate synesthesia instantly. So when you're saying that he's not just a musician, he's not just an ear guy. You have to look into the fact he's a tactile synesthesic. You got anesthetic. What do you got? Anesthete. So he's a synesthete. You know, anesthete. Anyways, I wanted to mention that. That's what I would say you're trying to say. That Zappa is multimodal. Go ahead.
His genius of just to jump into the electronic, like the synclad. It'd be interesting to hear what. I mean, that was an unknown instrument at the time. Jumped in there.
That's a later development, Bert. What he did on Lumpy Gravy and World for Money, he makes a statement on the back of the album. He points out that this is not electronically something. It is electronically altered. He makes a distinction. He's basically describing virtual reality, that he is making up sounds. He is not using electricity to enhance them or amplify them. And he makes that statement on the back of We're Only for the Money. He maybe if we could Google it, somebody has the album in detail, they might tell us. You have to read it carefully. He points out that he is altering things to in the studio that nobody would understand because they didn't have access. The normal consumer didn't have access to the studio and what was going on. He was trying to make a very technical point that he was actually making up music.
Yes, for example, Wagner is very interesting because he was trying to expand also the possibilities of what you could make with music. And as you said, he was already trying to include the multimedia. But what he did, he will use like double orchestras.
Yeah.
And his pieces last like 8 hours or 6 hours. To develop his ideas, he needs amazing. I mean, the resources just to present such operas. I mean, I think only here in Germany there is this festival of Wagner music. I mean, where can that be done with double orchestras and choirs and all these? He was trying to expand.
Right, so he's doing this at the time the telegraph comes in. His dates are May 22nd, 1813, until 70 years later. He dies on February 13th, 1883. That's right when Joyce, Stravinsky, Picasso, and Lewis are born, 1881, 82, 83. So I'm looking at
and maybe it's like the climax of the tonal music because he was trying to achieve the most complex technically that you could with this system, with the Western
Karen's asking,
system.
Richard Wagner. Yeah. What was those last words? The last bit you said there?
Yeah, with the environment of the orchestra and the opera house, I mean, he was like the climax of the most you could do in that environment. And I think he did
what?
Yeah, he said, I challenge the next generation to come with something new, like innovative after me. So that's why Weber and Schoenberg and Stravinsky, what they could do is to go away of the tonality, to explore and the chromatic and microtonalities and multirhythms, because in that sense he had reached the climax.
Right. So here's what it says. He described the aesthetics of drama in this essay he wrote in 1851 called Opera and Drama that he was using to create the ring operas. Before leaving Dresden, Wagner had drafted a scenario that eventually became the 4-opera cycle, Der Ring der Nibelungen. He initially wrote the libretto for a single opera, in 1948. After arriving in Zurich, he was no longer in Germany, he was in exile. After arriving in Zurich, he expanded the story with the opera Der Young Siegfried, which explored the hero's background. He completed the text of the cycle by writing the libretti for the Valkyrie and then the Rheingold, and reversing the other libretti to agree with his new concept, completing them in 1852. The concept of opera expressed in this essay called Opera and Drama, in another essay, effectively renounced the operas he had previously written, up to and including Lohengrin, which was, I don't know what the meaning of that is, Lohengrin. Partly in an attempt to explain his change of views, Wagner published in 1851 the autobiographical quote titled A Communication to My Friends. This contained his first public announcement of what was to become the Ring Cycle. He says, I shall never write an opera more. As I have no wish to invent an arbitrary title for my works, I will call them dramas. I propose to produce my myth in 3 complete dramas preceded by a lengthy prelude. At a specially appointed festival, I propose, some future time, to produce those 3 dramas with their prelude in the course of 3 days and a 4-evening. Emphasis in original, the way he emphasized 3 days and a 4-evening. So he is expanding and doing this huge, many-hour experience when the telegraph comes in. He's responding to the telegraph, unconsciously or consciously, we don't know. But that's the point. Right when the telegraph's coming in, he feels the pressure of something new is required. He's actually starting to express the electric eternity. He's saying the opera refuses to die. He's going to make it last forever, 10 hours.
He had also a bigger agenda. He influenced Nietzsche, and Nietzsche influenced him also. Yeah. They were trying to make art for this new era, for the new Ubermensch.
The new gods. Yeah, the Ubermensch, the Superman. Yeah, in other words, they responded that somehow the electric environment, the telegraph, is extending people into a whole new area, and they felt it and said, we are bigger now. We have more organs. We have new environments attached to our chemical body, and we got to communicate to that. So Zappa ends that cycle. He comes in and completes the potentials of what one can do with this new technology and our new organs. So
yes, and in a way, Wagner had also this idea of his work being like a big cycle that presented the philosophy, the ideas. Like there was this retrieval of the antiquity.
Antiquity.
Yes, they wanted to present the mythic to the little man.
Mythic.
And to educate them and to make them connect to the sublime, to the divine.
Right. In a way, they had Gnostic ambitions. Nothing wrong with that. But
that's why both were abused by the Nazis as part of their program.
Both?
Of their
Nietzsche
both
and Wagner.
Nietzsche and Wagner were used by the Nazis for propaganda purposes. Like, this is our cause.
Well, how about this? The Nazis, living in the radio environment, which would be invisible to them, they wanted to use the more recent, older technologies, but were electric. So the thinkers of that were Nietzsche and Wagner. And if they were living in the present and aware of the electric effect of the radio, they would have used Joyce or Verez.
Yes, and it's very interesting how the radio activated this tribal thing in Germany. It was the first nation with Volks radio, Volkswagen, Volks.
Right, the folk. Volks means the folk. Yeah. And they had
the Volkswagen, also the Volks radio. Like, it was part of the program that everybody had to be infiltrated with these new technologies to program.
The tribal drum. Radio was the tribal drum. But I just want to say kudos for Roxy. What do you think of that, Bert? she is catching up to me by saying Zappa is the new Bach. That's pretty big statement.
Yes.
What do you think of that?
Yes, it's a very big statement, but what we've presented so far, I mean, she's spot on. I mean, with her musical background, she has the credentials to make such a statement because I support her presentation. He is. I mean, Frank Zappa is the new Bach. And a question for Roxana: are you in your spare timing? Are you considering composing yourself electronically?
Yes, I always do. Yes, now we have a new secret project. Yeah.
Oh, okay. All right.
Yeah, you'll be part of the content of it, Bert. You're going to be part of the content of it, Bert. You're going to be massaged. She's going to take, like the Nazis who took Nietzsche and Wagner as their content. Well, she's going to take Bert as her content and massage it into some new non-physical manifesto.
Okay.
Okay, so Roxy wanted me to talk about tetramagnesium. So this is the background to that, and then
yes, because the thing with Zappa is he's translating what McLuhan said of men have the same value, and he's the first one that dares to go and take things from popular culture, like this type of speech and phrases and cliches and archetypes, and mix it all together. And he takes all sound landscapes from the environment with samplers, but also from media and from the musical traditions. He really knew about music.
Right.
And he will say he never read, for example, but he did read a lot. And for example, we saw
Mike Willis tells that.
The Masonic books. He had a lot of Masonic books, but I'm sure he was aware of everything that was going on.
Ike Willis, in my dialogue with Ike Willis about AIDS and Thingfish, he was a close friend, dropped in a lot on Frank in the 80s, and he said there was always books and manuals and technologies there. You know, it was a laboratory. And it's like Frank, we're going to get into this, the difference between Frank Zappa as the public TV body icon and in the actual Frank Zappa. He discusses that, the difference in this 1984 tome called Them or Us. He talks about the difference. And I'm going to do that. Let me see.
Yes, and like everybody says he's a big revolutionary innovator, but nobody explains really what's going on from the point of view of the evolution of the media and the environment, and why he appeared and what he's doing all these mix and already showing the new hybrid that of the artist-scientist that sees all creations as a type of music. Right. He was already trying to make the new song.
Right. And, you know, the band was called The Mothers in 1965, and radio programmers knew that was a slang term for, a very good musician or a rough musician or a wide-open, powerful musician. Also can refer to motherfuckers. So maybe that's what they meant. That guy's a motherfucker, and they'd compliment his musical ability. So the radio programmers, when the company signed him in 65, 66, I think he was signed in November 65, so it was the 50th anniversary month. They said, you've got to change your name. Your record won't get played as Mothers. So they either suggested Mother's invention or he came up with it. So I'm not sure. The point is, what a perfect name, because you might as well just say Marshall McLuhan. To say Mothers of Invention, you're studying the technique of inventing. You're looking at the effects of invention. You're looking at what comes before invention, the mothers, the birth of invention. It's so appropriate, and he was so lucky to get that name. You know, Mothers of Invention.
Yes.
It's language having its say. So
we have now the of invention.
Beg your pardon?
We will do the matrix of invention.
We are the magic of invention. Oh, matrix. The matrix of invention.
Matrix invention, yeah.
MATRIX is what you're saying, Roxy?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes.
So, yeah, it's very interesting. Like, this is the first time I've had a chance to have someone else who knows something about music to support my statement of the importance of Zappa. I remember when I used to look at him, pictures of him in the 60s, he would have a profile picture, and he'd have this long flowing hair. He looked like Mozart. He looked like a Beethoven, you know, the cliche we had of these long-haired guys 200 years ago. He actually, there was this guy, a rock musician, but if you had a silhouette of him, he was a Mozart. He was a Beethoven, a Chopin. That's the face he had, you know, and it looked very odd probably to people. Probably so odd they said, oh, I'm not going to listen to this guy. This is some guy, a classical composer. I don't know why he's in Melody Maker or Rolling Stone, but certainly not a rocker. So I'll ignore that article. And the people, the mass mind always ignores what's really going on, you know, unwittingly.
Yeah.
So I would like to now develop this whole stuff we're saying by going through the screenplays. And is that okay with you guys? Is there any...
but maybe you could play the first video of you're talking in the Zappanale, because there you explain very well this Frank Zappa being a tactile artist, and because this is being heard by other musicians and people that maybe it's new for this environment. Okay, I think it's important to have it there.
Yeah, so I'll bring up... so I have to go over to ianandbob.com because...
yes, in the meantime, I would like to say in the preface of the Laws of Media, Eric McLuhan says, this is new food for thought, and this is a new science. And
he said new food for thought?
Yeah. For thought and meditation.
Right.
And yeah, the new science is the new food for all the bodies.
Yes, yeah.
And,
correct. And that anticipates what we're doing.
Burger Zappa was talking about last week.
Yeah, we are a new kitchen here with Iandom and with Carolyn Dean, and making new foods. They're not supplements. They're not vitamins or minerals or something extra new to it, and that's why we call them completements. They complete the body and the cellular structure. So Ion is Zappa, McLuhan, and Joyce are predicting the new cook, the new kitchen. The new song is partly a new kitchen. So here is the video. Let me now what's happening. This is in August 2011. Ben Watson and I are at the Zappanale in a place in Germany called Bad Doberan. It used to be in East Germany, the Eastern Bloc. Bad Doberan. And near it is Peenemünde, where the Nazi rocket scientists did their rocket experiments before, I guess, and during World War II. So we're into that dark area, which Thomas Pynchon writes about in his various novels, in Gravity's Rainbow especially. So there's lots of bands playing Zappa music, and they give us a tent where we can, Ben and I can present our verbal critical statement, know-it-alls, stick in the mud intellectuals. That would be how we'd be perceived. And there was so much noise coming from the concert nearby that Ben said, I can't talk with this noise in the background. Nobody hears. I said, well, fuck that. I'm going to talk. I didn't come all the way over here not to do it because it's some band in the background, and the band, I think they eventually did stop. So Ben let me speak first. I don't know if he spoke before me, but basically I took over. So I hope you hear how I introduce myself to the Zappa fanatics. what I said led to several of them walking out immediately. I think my want to do is to insult people, being a Manipian by training, by habit. And knowing it was being taped, I had to preserve it for the posterity, for my audience here. So I was performing not for them, but for the cash flow. So we bring up the, click off this, open the mic. And if it's not so clear, audible, I'll explain it after. So, have I got everything on? Sound. Yep, Soundflower is ready. Okay, let's see if it starts here.
There it goes. So just aim that towards us. You see?
Okay.
Okay, so what I'm doing is Ben's wife is there, and I'm showing her how to hold the camera and which way to position it. Just a side thing. Walter Boert said that to me back in 1990. I think he says it on that video up in the cabin in Paradise, New Mexico, and corner of New Mexico is Arizona and whatever else is around there is where this place called Paradise. So now, if I would talk about Zappa to Walter, he wasn't interested. He didn't have much. He just would say, "Look, I interviewed Zappa," we interviewed him in 1967 for the East Village Other, and he thought that we were CIA. That's all he would say. That's all he could say. He never got over that. And he didn't listen to Zappa, so he didn't know. So here is Walter Boert, an expert on MK Ultra, and I'd have to tell him that, well, Frank is doing a new form of expose of the new kind of MK Ultra. So he didn't want to explore Zappa very much. So he says, I had met him. Well, he could have been one of these people if he'd gotten a little more clued into what was going on. But, if I said stuff about Zappa in this big, huge way, he thought it was ridiculous. So there I was, walking around being an invisible environment. My mouth was an invisible environment back then. Okay? So I'm telling Ben, showing Ben's wife how to position the camera, how I would like it. You hear that, Roxy? He says, we think about that talking about music is the next stage. That's what we do. We don't play Zappa, we talk about him.
Yes.
Yeah.
That's part of what Ayun has been saying. It's all about the frequency. And,
right.
And this understanding of the environment, of the ionic. He's talking all the time about the frequency.
Talking about talking.
Yeah.
And the effects of talking, not just what the verbal meaning is. So Ben's right on there. He says, I like the way he says, we think it's the next phase, talking, after consuming music. So great statement by Ben.
Civilization phase number 3.
What'd you say?
Phase number 3.
Phase number 3, right. Okay, just move it back a bit. Here we go. And you guys, I didn't mute you, so you guys got to be quiet.
Next stage after music. Because I frequently interrupt Bob, I promised him to give him...
Jesus, he says it's the next stage after music. Music in general. That's pretty fucking amazing. The next phase of art is talking. And definitely I'm the greatest talker going today for my quad.
He was channeling Ion.
Yes.
Yeah.
Ben's not even going to talk, but he knew what he'd hoped to do, but he doesn't like the conditions.
And he hates Ion.
That's the thing. It's not about only the music. Until now, all musicians want to develop that.
Not about the music.
Yeah, the great musicians, the great composers were just expanding on Bach to the most. Yes. But then Zappa, it's the new hybrid of infiltrating the popular culture, high culture, all technologies, and erasing all boundaries and showing the new ground. That's the thing.
Yeah, Zappa is probably the first composer. I've heard many people say that. On YouTube, there's many many appearances by Frank on C-SPAN and interviews, they don't talk about his music. They say, I love listening to him talk. That's what they say. I mean, his reputation has come back in a new way thanks to YouTube, where people who never heard him, never got involved with him, but just happened to, maybe because I advised them to, they start listening to his interviews and they're very impressed. Hey, Carolyn, that thing is beeping over there. So, so this is what Ben agrees. We're Zappophiles, Zappatists. We're saying talking is the next art. Now, it doesn't mean talking that everybody does on talk shows and blah, blah, blah. It's a new kind of talking that's required. And Frank was a prophet of it. Are you noticing what I'm doing there? I'm claiming that Zappa said in 1971, what you guys all know, Wyndham Lewis in 1929. So I start off with a lie. I'm quoting Lewis in 1929. I'm saying Frank said this in 1971. I'm saying no one noticed that Frank said it. Everybody missed it. And even there, Ben doesn't even notice that I'm lying. This is awesome. I forgot I did this. Okay, so we'll carry on.
Dynamic there's a four-way interplay of relationships there. You got monarchism in his Marxism, anarchism in his healthy passion for order, and he's a communist sometimes, fascist at other times. Now, the hidden pattern for this is the sensory interplay known as tactility. Tactility is not the sense of touch. It's the interplay of the senses, not a particular sense in itself. And the main pattern for the electric environment is the extension of the tactile sense, an interplay, not any particular senses. So what we have, thanks to Ben, he pointed out to me once that the Renaissance of the 1920s was painting. That was the revolutionary art form, got a lot of attention in reaction to movies, radio, and automobiles, and newspapers. So we can see the 20s were emphasizing the eye. The eye was the first reaction to the interplay of electric tactility. Then we have the next revolution, Ben points out, in the 60s, where it shifts to the ear. Rock music, avant-garde music, all kinds of experiments with sound around ear. That was the ear's response, a familiar sense, as people encountered the tactile interplay of the global theater, which means satellite, computers, radio, newspaper, television, and the beginning of the digital. That interplay retrieved a renaissance in ear experience, just like the 20s retrieved a renaissance in eye experience. Now, Ben has wondered what comes next. Well, with the digital computer world, where people actually have a chance to speak back to the media that's presented to them, it's not a one-way broadcasting situation. That essentially is a tactile interplay, but with more and more consumer control of what the content of that interplay is. So we have that tactility becomes a figure in the 80s and 90s until now. Think of this interacting by digital extensions and digital extended people playing with the eye and all the archive of media that the eye created in the 20th century, mixing with the archive of media around the ear, and then newspapers, and then books, and video images. So this whole mixture that people can start to edit and play with since the 90s is tactility itself becoming the form of response to whatever you call this weird media world that people have been in for 30 years. So I see that the third renaissance is the retrieval of tactility itself since the 90s, where people can play with any sensory modality and have a sense of editing themselves and have a sense of autonomy. The autonomy happened more in Web 2.0 than it did in Web 1.0. So in this tactile situation that we have extended all around us over the last 25 years, I propose that Frank Zappa was not an eye man, he was not an ear man, he was a tactile man. and he could use any form of experience and call it music. He could compose with his ashtray. Now, when you look at his statement in Hot Rats, this movie for your ears, 1969, he is still reacting to the ear dynamic of the 60s, but he has a heavy visual bias, being an artist himself, a designer, drawing since he was a kid, drawing his scores. There's Frank reacting to the tactile environment, but it apparently seems that he's a musician working with visual editing schemes. You can see this in his interview with Barry Miles in International Times magazine, August, September 1969. That is a good explanation of that phase, but little people realize that Frank was going to drop the Mothers, move into a new phase in the 70s. You have this lull with the Turtles, producing more theatrical events, which is another part of high visual culture. Does that for a year and a half or so. Then he has his accident. And then he comes bursting forth in 73 and 74, featuring work with video. He was hoping to get on the Playboy channel the piece called A Token of My Extremes. Now here's Frank beginning to play with interactivity and to wake up not the eye or the ear around the movie dynamic or even the radio dynamic. He is moving into tactility as presented by television, and that's where Bruce Bickford comes in. Any Baby Snake or any Bickford production is nothing but fluidity, metaphoricing and metamorphing and playing with all the sensory dynamics of his clay work. Now the shifting and mutating is the best the eye can see of tactility. You can't see the interplay of sensory work known as tactility, but the best expression of that is constant movement shifting, shape-shifting almost, that Bruce Bickford presented. So there's a whole new aesthetic that Frank is presenting in the 70s, featured and emphasized around Bruce Bickford. And he also gets more fluid in the way he, as Ben calls it, his corporate rock phase in the 70s and early 80s. Then what does Frank do? In the 80s, he moves into digital work, retreats from active performance, and starts playing with what he called digital dust. Now he's really getting into tactility, but it's a virtual form of tactility. So, that's what I'm proposing here. That the way to understand Frank is conceptual, philosophical background to the degree there could be any, since any form of human expression would be the content of his presentation. The actual form is the tactile interplay of anything for, what is that quote then? Anything available anywhere, blah, 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 God, composition, chord. Remember 1969, that quote, maybe you know it? The first one,
anything at all, any time,
available medium.
with no excuses. I can't remember it either. Can you?
Not anything, anytime, not anywhere.
No, another one.
Yeah, any available medium, the big note, God. He says it lists all the senses. A couple of big things. That's his first mixed media statement about 1969. It's in Dave Wally's book. Came out in the early 70s. The point is that we see that the revolution of the last 30 years, the extension of tactility itself, Frank was in the foreground of that. This is how you understand Frank in the 70s and the 80s and 90s. Is Frank, the tactile engineer, more and more making tactility the metaphor for how he saw what was happening to everybody. He was not an eye man anymore, he was not an ear man. Now, there's a very good quote by Carl Radek, who, discussing James Joyce's Ulysses, said something. This is how I adapt that quote. Carl Radek's quote would apply to this, to Frank, at least in the early 70s period. A heap of dung crawling with musicians photographed by a television apparatus through a microscope. Okay? That quote, done 60 years before, let's say, by Carl Radek, who died about 1947, killed in the Gulag or whatever. That quote leads to the point. Ben has discussed the movie 200 Motels as about rubbish. Now, Ben likes to point out Theodore Adorno as a conceptual parallel to Zappa. I propose Marshall McLuhan, because Marshall McLuhan was the philosopher who explained tactility and how it was extended through television. So if you look at Marshall's work, Frank did not play with time. He discussed decorating time, but that was not really what he was doing. He was shaping time, in other words, shaping space. And this is where Ben brings up the word isoplastic, a shaping of things into one. That is exactly what tactility could be, a shaping of all the senses into a coherent sense of consciousness. That what you see is organized by your tactile interplay. So the organizing of spaces that the different senses create, the playing of the ear space, the eye space, and then later the tactile space, is the essence of Frank's agenda. So that you can include these ideas, these phrases. Frank Zappa makes people dumb. He does that with cellular signaling. He eschews, does not focus on the univocal approach or bias. And every Zappa concept, percept, and musical rhythm comes from Finnegan's Wake. Finnegan's Wake is the first book that is full-blown tactility in print. You cannot read with your eyes Finnegan's Wake. You can mix your senses, eye, ear, touch, smell, and kinesis with Finnegan's Wake, and then you get the rhythm of it. There's so much of what Frank did in the 70s and 80s as a translation of the dynamics of Finnegan's Wake. Ben wrote recently that, maybe this was 2008, he wrote that me, Bob Dobbs, has the advantage of recognizing that Frank Zappa is the James Joyce of electronic media. That's a very accurate statement if you understand electronic as a tactile apparatus, playing with all the senses and their extensions. When you get into some of the theatrical elements like cyborg or the robotic or some of the virtual characters in Them or Us, that screenplay, you start to see Frank working not just with the senses, but whole landscapes of technologies. And the Synclavier was the best way to do that. And I think if you look at the cover of Civilization Phase 3, you see a big rock, you see UFOs, sort of things coming in, you see a photo of New York City, you see, what else, Ben? You see Roman stuff. It's a mixture of landscapes. And so it has a patina of blackness, because Marshall McLuhan said, since tactility is not a color, the only way you can present tactility visually is use the image of black. Black is the absolute color.
My perception of Phase 3 is it's all Egyptian. Scarabs, pyramids. I don't see much other civilization. It seems to be almost entirely Egyptian.
No, you see I live in New York City, you recognize the aerial view of New York City embedded in the cover. But the Egyptian is that's relevant. Yeah. Marshall McLuhan said that the pharaohs, they shaped whole cultures. He said the art of the 20th century tends back towards the Egyptian. Now this is very interesting how young Frank Zappa, he was born 30 years after Marshall McLuhan, but many of Frank's ideas were like a popular translation of Marshall McLuhan, even though Frank did not have that detailed an acquaintance of Marshall McLuhan. He had read a couple of his books and had nobody to talk about it with other than me, but he picked up on the tactility and the Egyptian nature. This is the Cletus Aurelius mode. The Egyptian art takes the whole environment and programs it. Frank's intercontinental absurdities, United Mutations, and his emperor aristocratic demeanor was him processing the whole range of content in the global theater, just as Joyce did with Finnegan's Wake, just as Burroughs tried to do. Frank was the only one doing it in music. Everybody got consumed and absorbed into Frank's dynamic. That is, McLuhan said, an Egyptian style of art, programming the whole world. Now, I don't know if Frank knew McLuhan said that, but again, he picked up on the point about it being Egyptian, programming the whole environment. And that is what I call a satellite conductor. The popular mythology. 2 minutes?
I'm going to come in soon.
Okay. This is what I do. I work Ben up. And just ass starts swinging, so it's coming close. I have other parts I'll develop later. But to end, I'll quote T.S. Eliot's definition of the auditory imagination. And I'll put in Zappa's name. What I call Frank Zappa is the feeling for syllable and rhythm penetrating far below the conscious levels of thought and feeling, invigorating every word, sinking to the most primitive and forgotten, returning to the origin and bringing something back, seeking the beginning and the end. It works through meaning, certainly, or not without meanings in the ordinary sense, and fuses the old and obliterated, and the trite, the current, and the new and surprising, the most ancient Egyptian, and the most civilized mentality, Los Angeles. That is the auditory imagination which had become ordinary awareness, McLuhan said, by 1970. What was not ordinary awareness was the imagination of Phineas Wake. But Frank started to sculpt that in the 70s, 80s, 90s. Starting very well.
I don't want to compete with the music on the stage. I think this is going to be too hard. So, Mr. Bob Dobbs, thank you very much.
Well, I'll continue. I'll compete against the stage. But they maybe just work it out. Go for it. They're just fiddling around.
Yeah, they're just fiddling around doing that ego thing of musicians, like showing that they can tune their instruments for us.
Okay, what an awesome statement. I can see it's fucking incredible what I said there. And Ben sitting there, I'm not sure if I'm reading his face right, but he's not used to having someone else talk and dominate beside him. He's sitting there like gritting his teeth the whole 16 minutes, and then he refuses to say anything at the end because somebody's tuning up in the background. But I guess the recording stopped. His wife stopped the recording at that point. I guess not much was said, but man, that is a coherent statement. It's incredible. We'll have to transcribe it.
The amazing thing for me was to see how that connected to your chart. There is this transcription. You can go to Ian and Bob, to the memo to Prince Charles, and it's from the Revelations transcription, in which Ian is saying the tiny chart. It's the angel perspective of what Bob is explaining, and he says Bob actually influenced Zappa in his concept of the big note, because Zappa had the big note and Bob has the tiny note. And for me, just to read that, I was like, wow! Because since Ian appeared, he started to point out the importance of the chart, and what's on the chart is part of the revelation John was trying to bring forth. And this is the ionic aspect of what we are talking about here, that this was showing the new environment coming with the ionic technologies. Was
right. Did you say Jung, meaning Carl Jung?
Sorry?
You said Jung, meaning Carl Jung? You said Jung. Carl Jung, the psychologist.
No.
Oh, okay.
No.
But when you say Revelation, you're talking about the Book of Revelation, and it's singular, Book of Revelation. Ian says, and what she's reading from is a transcript of a postgraduate seminar that Ian was running for rewrite session number 5, November 17th, 2010. So this is being said many months before, almost a year before I go to Bad Dobron and say this to the Zappa public. And I'll have to tell you the environment. It's a tent. There are people at a bar behind us. There are people walking around. I don't know if there was more than 2 people listening. People were talking, engaging, and it's interesting how they are so involved in what they're talking to. They don't seem concerned that this other thing is going on. They don't look over and say, why are those 2 guys sitting there in the middle of the tent talking? Who are they talking to? There's no curiosity. So we even show in this video a post-information society. I'm there making this astounding communication to the Zappa fans, and not too many are paying attention to it. So there's is that a PR problem? Do I have to shoot somebody to get somebody's attention?
Did some people actually leave when you started off?
Yes, my insulting statement, I said, my opening statement was, never have I seen so many stupid people celebrating a stupid composer and having such a great time.
Yay!
and then immediately I saw three guys in the back get up and walk out. And occasionally there's an occasional person after that, but those three guys walked out with a sense of incomprehension or being pissed off. Either one. They weren't going to put up with that kind of statement. But it was an incredible statement. I was actually complimenting them. I was saying, yeah, they're proving here that stupid people can have a good time. Never have seen so many stupid people celebrating such a stupid composer and having a great time at it. So I covered myself. I sort of put in a contradictory emotion by saying, hey, you guys are having a good time. It's nice. But so in that context, this amazing statement, and Ben, for the first time, has to shut up for 10 minutes. Man, was he gritting his teeth. That's how his facial expression looks. He may not be, but... and, he goes on later to disagree with me. I don't think... Ben doesn't get it. And Kevin Currier wrote a book on Zappa called The Dangerous Kitchen. And he objects to Ben's book, which is, I find, a really good, stimulating book. But, I can tolerate all kinds of depth because I know so much. So the average Zappa fan hates Ben's book, and they don't think it has anything to do with Zappa. But Ben's talking about Wyndham Lewis and James Joyce and Phineas Wake. So Kevin Currier said, Ben doesn't understand American culture. Growing up in England, they just don't get the subtleties that Zappa's talking about. So he objected to that part of Ben's book. And I said, well, the man you used to explain Frank, who understood American culture and lived it, was Marshall McLuhan. And I said, I think I should do something. He goes, do it! Do it! It's got to be done. It's incredible. We can knock off Ben. We must knock off Ben as the uber intellectual guy, come up with a better thing. And I forgot that I actually said that right in front of Ben. I said, Ben talks about the Frankfurt School and Theodore Adorno. I think McLuhan's a better explainer of Frank. And then I proceeded to do it. But I said that right in front of him. So maybe that's why he looked pissed off. But it's actually interesting that we're supposed to do a joint panel, and he doesn't say anything. That's what's happened. The past 20 years, I'm the only guy who can talk. Nobody else can talk about what's going on intelligently or perceptively. And so no matter whatever I showed up, I'm the Donald Trump. Everybody shuts up, and Bob throws his perceptive insults all around the room, and nobody says anything. Just let Bob do. So Ben was showing that there was no audience for me. Even he wouldn't interact with me. So again, the monologue continues until we met Roxy, and then Roxy can dialogue and actually knows more than I do in certain areas that prove my case, which is what Ben's complimenting her about. So congratulations, all of you. Ben for noticing it, and Roxy for doing it, and me for creating it.
Yes, for me, it's amazing how all these pieces of this big puzzle fall together and fit together, and because we have this tradition of grammarians explaining the Bible, trying to understand the book, trying to understand what God is, and also in the laws of media, they talk about how optics were very important because the scientists wanted to understand what we were talking about the glory, about the light, and these first things that made the creation. The Word at the beginning was the Word, and the light were like the motivation for all these people to go and try to understand this thing we call God.
The light in the book. Yeah, in the book of Scripture, they're trying to read the light in the Word.
And actually, we ended up in this situation of fragmentation in which science refuses to acknowledge the non-physical. And right. They're starting to get into points like parallel worlds and the particles and into genetic, in which they somehow, to go further, have to recognize the non-physical, because otherwise there is no more progress. And this is what McLuhan saw.
Yeah.
There is this new science in which there is no more fragmentation. Everything is synesthetic, tactile, simultaneous. And Zappa was already a tactile, post-literate artist, and Bob is also...
I'm a post-literate tactile talker. A little non-physical on the
Rhapsode.
A little non-physical. A tactile talker.
Well, the thing is, we are expanding into not making any more paintings or music. It's a new environment, and it's funny how now that it's already the post-literate age. For example, the West are defending the values of the Enlightenment, of the people that wanted to have all the knowledge in an encyclopedia, a collection of books, and are fighting against the one-book people. It's like
the manuscript people. Call them manuscripts.
Yes.
The Muslims are devoted to a manuscript culture.
Yes, it's the retrieval of the crusade, and McLuhan always, he talked many times about the new crusade, and he will say the crew, like the crew in a plane or in a ship, and crusade. And it's funny how the day in which the Templars order was dissolved was Friday the 13th. Was the same date as the Paris attacks, and the dissolution of the Templars was called by the King of France. I think was Philippe Le Quatrième, the fourth. And it's very interesting how these things are like a retrieval of this situation where now the post-literacy and the new environment coming forth, and people trying to make sense of what's solving the thing, the environment they know.
Yeah, no, I think Jean delay. Do you hear me a bit on delay, Roxy?
No.
No.
So you hear me as I'm speaking. When I'm trying to interrupt you, you